Awesome. So speak like that.
Okay. Yeah, all right, let's do it. We're holding today Daf Yud. We're actually holding on the Testament base on the bottom. Gene, all I was saying was I didn't want your phone call to be recorded. I just didn't want it to be recorded, that's all. No, it's all good. You could open it up right here. I didn't know if it was a private conversation, so that way the whole world, because the whole world is watching. I didn't want the whole world to hear, exactly, yeah.
No, yeah, he's coming here for his
I spoke to Susan Wojciechowski. She told us that our YouTube channel is the fastest growing YouTube channel in YouTube.
She said they're demonetizing.
They're demonetizing us for our political views. Okay.
That's a new word.
Demonetization, deplatforming. Okay. So it says in the Mishnah, we're going to discuss a very interesting series of halachas over here. Are you allowed to bring a carbon nowadays? Am I allowed to build a mizbech in my backyard? And then after I build that mizbech, am I allowed to bring up a carbon on that mizbech? This is going to come up in today's daf. So, spoiler alert here, that technically speaking, we don't do it nowadays. I haven't seen it. If you meet someone who does do it, I think pretty much you should probably send them to a doctor. But regardless, it's not so pashut that it's usher. I mean, it's not. So, it's at least a discussion. But let's first discuss a couple of things.
Guys are biased.
They do it.
Yeah, you do have some people. Yeah, that's true. And it wasn't like the people who started asking these questions were the crazies. We're talking about already in the times of the Rishonim, the Kafta V'Ferach asked the question, why don't we do it nowadays? And you'll see exactly what the basis for that is in the Gemara. It's brought famous Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. In the early 1800s, he wrote Tshuva to him. They went back and forth a little bit. Other Talmidim, the Aruch HaNer, discussed the Shaila. It's a legit question, even up until nowadays. Even Gedolei Torah, even today have they don't discuss it in a practical sense, but we'll discuss exactly what it's related to. But before we do, I think it's important to just give a very, very brief understanding of the background for the next two Mishnayos, and it's off of the second Mishnah that the first half of today's daf is going to be related. The second half of today's daf, which we're only going to do half of, because the second half of it is really the Iker story of Megillah Esther, and I wanted to sort of not shortchange that. I think it's very important to learn those psukim at least somewhat well, so that as we're going into Purim, we have an appreciation for it. Okay, so just very quickly, the Mishnah. We'll read the Mishnah inside, and then we'll explain. The Mishnah is on the second to last Mishnah. There's two Mishnahs over here. The first Mishnah says, "Ein bein bama gedola lebama ketana ela psachim." We'll define bama ketana and bama gedola in a minute. So the only distinction between a bama gedola and a bama ketana is a carbon pesach. Zeh haklal. The following is the rule as it pertains to bamais. A bama ketana, bama gedola. Kol shehu nider v'nidev karab b'bama. Anything that is voluntary, any of the karbonos that are not obligatory, they're not chiyuvim, but rather I'm just volunteering it, a neder or a nedava. Those can be brought up on a personal bama. The kol she'enoi lo nidev v'lo nidev. Whereas if it's something that is a chiyuv, not something that I'm voluntarily doing, then enoi karab b'bama, it can't be brought up on my personal altar. It needs to be brought up on the communal altar. So let's just give a brief akdam over here. When we left Mitzrayim, and for 1 year we did not have like a mishkan or a mikdash or any sort of makom avodah. We just related to Hashem directly. Then we did the Chet HaEgel, we got kapara, there's the chashnias, and after that, 40 days later, Hashem said, right, we have the mishkan. We were told to build the mishkan. We ended up having a mishkan already by the second year. So for the 40 years in the Midbar, we had 39 of them. We had the Mishkan. Then from there, we entered Eretz Yisrael, Yehoshua, and pretty much the entire Sefer Yehoshua dealt with the next 14 years was split up. Yeah, it was split up between actually conquering Eretz Yisrael and then splitting up the land of Eretz Yisrael amongst the tribes. So for those 14 years, the Mishkan that we had in the Midbar, in the desert, entered in with us, and we continued doing the Avodah in Eretz Yisrael for 14 years, and it was in the city of Gilgal. After the city of Gilgal, they moved it to a city called Shiloh. Shiloh is in Shevet. It was in Yosef's Chelek. That's the famous Rashi that says why was Binyamin kissing Yosef, and Yosef was kissing Binyamin. Yosef was kissing Binyamin and crying over the churban of the two Batei Hamikdash that were in the Chelek of Binyamin, and Binyamin was crying in Yosef over the destruction of Shiloh, because Shiloh is where we had the Mishkan for the next 369 years. After it was in Shiloh, there was 57 years between the destruction of Shiloh before Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, and then those 57 years it was in the city of Noiv and Giv Oin. So that means that we had a Mishkan we had a Beis Hamikdash after that for 410 years, then 70-year break, and then another 420 years for Bayis Sheni. So those are the Bati Hamikdash, and then we had Shiloh. So the Beis Hamikdash Rishon, Beis Hamikdash Sheni, and Shiloh, those are considered, and I'm going to simplify it here, those are considered sort of like a more permanent or quasi-permanent status of a Beis Hamikdash, a Makam Aveda, whereas the other times when you had the Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael for the first 14 years in Gilgal and the next 57 years after Shiloh before the first Beis Hamikdash, so those collective 71 years, we had sort of this lower level. So what we'll refer to as the higher level as it was kavua, it was established, versus Eina kavua. So now why am I mentioning this? Because we're going to see in this Mishnah and in the next Mishnah what exactly the differences were between, number one, the halachos that applied to the lower Eino kavua ones versus when it was kavua. And then once we're discussing the kavua ones, even between Shiloh and the Batei HaMikdash, there was also a distinction. Okay, that's part one of the Hakdam. Part two of the Hakdam is, what is a bama? So to the uninitiated and anyone who's just sort of observing Yiddishkeit, if I were to say, hey, am I allowed to bring a carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash? Most people would say, no, not only is it aser, you're chayiv kares if you do it. It's called shchutei chutz. It's basically taking hegdish, checking it outside the Beis Hamikdash, and bringing it up on my own personal mizbeach. This would be a very, very big problem if someone is doing it during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's the key point. If it's when there is an alternative, meaning when we're supposed to be doing it inside the Beis Hamikdash, then doing it outside is a problem. So this is the question. The distinction between when we do bamais, when I'm allowed to build a mizbeach, like in my porch, in my backyard. I can live in Arzei Avira, build really anywhere, like even Chutz La'aretz, build my own personal altar, and I want to bring up a carbon. Can I do that? So the halacha is that, or the way it comes out is that during the first bias, during the second bias, and during Shiloh, because those were considered this more permanent level of Kedusha, you cannot do it anywhere other than in Shiloh or the two Batei HaMikdash. Whereas if it was during the times when we only had the Mishkan for the first 14 years and those later 57 years, then you'd be allowed to have a bama. Not only would you be allowed to, it was considered a normal thing to do. You'd have a bama, you'd bring a carbon up. In the Mishnah, so there you're already touching on something that's slightly different, which is when exactly did heter bamas come in? It's in the Torah. It's not clear that was a heter bamas. It could be that over there they're just pashut was no makom kvias at all. So it could be there. It would be done anywhere. So just to quickly wrap up that second piece, the two pieces together. There were two separate statuses for avodah when we had Shiloh and the Batei HaMikdash versus when we only had the regular Mishkan. When you have Shiloh in the Beis HaMikdash, you could not do a personal altar in your backyard. Whereas if it was during the times when you just had the Mishkan in Gilgal, Nov, and Givon, during those 71 years, you'd be allowed to do a bama, what's referred to a personal altar. Now, the question is, when we say that you're allowed to do during those 71 years, and again, why is this relevant now? Because if the halacha during those 71 years was that you were allowed to do a bama, so I'm going to say like this: what about in between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni? What about after Bayis Sheni? That's the question. Meaning, can I go in my backyard right now, build a bama, and bring up a carbon to Hashem? Is this halacha l'maisa, or is this just ma'ada hava, whatever happened to happen? That is a question, and that is a question in our Mishnah, right? And that's a question that comes up now. So what I'm saying is as follows. The first Mishnah is going to be discussing, well, let's pretend that you're allowed to bring a bama in your backyard. Well, what are you supposed to be bringing up on that altar? Is it everything? So that's what the first Mishnah that we just read is telling us. So did you have a question?
Yeah, is the problem making a bama
Two
or
things.
taking hektish and
Both,
using
both,
it?
both,
So if
both.
I would make hektish al tanai that this is mutter and chuslar and outside the business, would that be us?
You're asking a very lumdish question. You're saying
is it the bama? That's the problem.
So I think it's both. Meaning, in fact, I think one of the Mefarshim explain one of the reasons why, if you read through the Psukim, you see that even during the existence of the Beis Hamikdash in the times of Ezra, that they didn't destroy all of these bamais that were supposed to be usher. And I think Mefarshim explain that the reason why they didn't is because besides the isser to do the avodah, there was an isser to build them or to destroy them. Like once they exist, like there was a separate problem of the building, the building of it and the destruction of it. So meaning, see, it's a strange thing what a bama is. It's on the one hand, it seems like it has like echoes of avodah zarah. It has like feelings of like you're doing something where you're not supposed to do it. In fact, we'll see in the Gemara shortly that was someone, one of Shimon HaTzadik's sons, who actually built a bama in Alexandria during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. and there's a discussion in I think in Menachos whether what he did was called Avodah Zarah or not. So there's certainly, right? So there's like an echo of it.
Because the bad guys did use them.
Of course, that's exactly how you did it. Of course, so, yeah. I mean, just think about it. It's like it's no different than nowadays. If like it's like fake crab or something. It's like to a certain extent you're touching on something that feels like it real. Bakos when I was growing up was like, what are you doing? Like that's my aunt and uncle who aren't very from. Like to them, Pesach is eating food that tastes bad. Like the second we make all this very enjoyable, so the way the goyim were doing their avodah zarah was on a bama. So why are we having bamos? It's like making shuls that look like a church. It's like it just feels funny. So again, just back to the Mishnah. So it says over here, our Mishnah is telling us what I'm allowed to bring up on this personal carbon and we'll call a bama katana. Now, why is it called a bama katana? Because there's a bama gadola. What's a bama gadola? A bama gadola is, well, if I'm allowed to bring a carbon up in my backyard, we're not saying, what's the Mishkan? The Mishkan has a Mizbeach also. So the bigger Mizbeach in the Mishkan is referred to as the bama gadola, and the bama that we have in my backyard, so think of it in English, it would be the big altar and the small altar. The big one is in the Mishkan, that's like going to shul. And the one in my backyard is like a personal, it's a Friday night minyan. It's not the main thing. It's something I'm doing in my backyard. It's exactly the same concept, except that nowadays we're doing tefillah.
Popular again now.
Well, okay, that's a separate conversation for a non-video recorded time. But basically, this is no different. Meaning, well, let's be honest. Tefillah is our version of bringing karbanos, right? So when we're doing it in our backyard, we're basically we're building a personal bama and. Right, like with Bilbavi Mishkan Evne, that's exactly what it is. Okay, so the Mishnah says, what is the distinction between the personal altar in my backyard? What am I allowed to bring up on that altar? Can I bring up anything? So here we have a Mishnah. Let's read it again now. Ein vein bama gedola lebama katana. The only distinction that exists between the karbanos that I could bring in the Mishkan versus what I could bring in my backyard, elab sachim. Meaning what? Meaning my carbon Pesach, I have to go to the Mishkan, either in Gilgal for the first 14 years, Nov and Givon in those other 57 years, but in those 71 years collectively, I can't bring my carbon Pesach in my backyard, but it sounds like I can pretty much do anything else.
Even though the original carbon Pesach
So even though, exactly. Right, so carbon Pesach would be the only thing. So now we're going to see that this is not true, but for now, for a moment, let's just hold that thought. Zehaklal. Now the Seif of the Mishnah says something a little bit different. Stira. What does it say over here? Here's the general rule. Kol shehu nider v'nidev carbon bama. If it's an obligatory carbon, you can't bring it in your backyard. The only things you're allowed to bring in your backyard are voluntary things. So if the Torah says you have to bring this carbon like a chatas, you did something wrong, you got to bring a chatas to get tshuva, to get kapara, then you can't bring that in your backyard. But if you wake up in the morning, you have such a hakaras hatov for the beauty of the sun shining on a great day, you say, I love Hashem, I want to take my sheep that's sitting in my backyard and be like, you know what, I'm makdish this sheep, I want to bring it up on the carbon, you could do that. That's not a problem. That's a neder, it's an adava, no big deal. However, if it's a chiyav, you can't. So again, that's the distinction, and that's what the Mishnah says. If it's an obligatory carbon, then eina carbon bama, meaning that needs to be taken into the Mishkan, into whether it's, again, if it's Nov and Givon or if it's in Gilgal, you would have to have brought it there to bring it up.
Is the Bama Gedola identical to the Beis HaMikdash?
No.
In other words, we didn't distinguish.
It was built. The Mishkan
But
was.
I mean, halachically.
No. There are other distinctions.
For that also.
Yeah. That is true. There are differences, and I'm not going to lie.
The whole design.
Well, no, but I'm saying in halachic differences what karbanos. So there is. We're going to see in the Gemara. Okay, let's read the Gemara and you'll see. Okay,
so what? Shlomim is good. You could do a shlomim.
So it depends if it's a shlomim of chiyuv or a shlomim of. There are some like if I'm making a neta, you can have an ola also. I'm allowed to bring a voluntary ola. I'm allowed to say to Hashem, I want this to be entirely burnt up to you. The distinction here isn't the type of carbon in terms of like whether it's a shlomim or a chata, an ola or a toda or whatever it is. The distinction here is whether you have a chiyuv to bring it up or not. If you have a chiyuv to bring it up, I mean, the Torah says, hey, you're a mitzorah, so you have to bring these karbanos when you're done. Well, no, that doesn't work. You got to go to the Mishkan for that. If it's the carbon that is of, like we discussed yesterday, I was talking about that carbon has to be brought up in the Mishkan. But if you want to, like I say, I could buy you breakfast, or I can invite you over to my house. Hey, man, let's go bring up a carbon together in my backyard. Let's praise Hashem, praise God, right? So that's pretty much what it is. Okay, so the Mishnah is going to tell us, the Mishnah has told us that the distinction in the Reisha is a carbon Pesach, whereas the distinction in the Seif, it seems, is all chiyuvim have to go into the Mishkan, whereas those things that are not chiyuvim don't have to go into the Mishkan. You can do that in your backyard. The Gemara is effectively asking psachim v'sulo, meaning it's a funny way for the Gemara to really ask the question is Ema Reisha, Ema Seifa, which is typically how it does it. It says the Reisha is a steer to the Seifa, but the Gemara says psachim v'sulo. I read the Reisha, it's mashma that the only thing I have to bring up on the Bama Gedola is carbon psachim, my carbon pesach, and everything else can go on my own personal altar. Gemara says no. Ema ke'ein psachim, and this is the answer. Meaning la'olam, what does it mean in the Reisha? When it says that you can't bring a carbon pesach in your backyard, it means anything like a carbon pesach. Meaning what? A carbon pesach is not something that you're voluntarily doing. It's something that you're obliged to do. Hashem says you got to bring a carbon pesach. So just like a carbon pesach you have to do, so to any carbon that you have to do has to be brought up on the altar, the Bama Gedola, whereas anything that's involuntary could be brought up on your own personal altar. Gemara says, one second. By specifically, I mean, you can ask a very intelligent question here. Why did you choose carbon pesach? You could have picked any one of the carbonos that are obligatory. Why did you choose carbon pesach? So Gemara says, based off of that, we can conclude that our Mishnah is taking sides indirectly in another machlekes. Money, who is our Mishnah? Reb Shimoni. How do I know that it's Reb Shimon? And which Reb Shimon? The Tanya, there's a brisa. Reb Shimon oimer af tzibor, lo hikrivu el psachim v'chovos shekavu lahem zman. I'm going to read it and then I'll explain it. Aval chovos she'ein kavu lahem zman, hacha v'hacha lo yikarev. So our Mishnah is really teaching us the distinction between my personal altar versus the altar in the Mishkan. It's not really discussing what you asked, what can be brought on the Mishkan on that Bama Gedola versus what normally would have been brought on a regular Mizbeach inside, let's say, the Mishkan and Shiloh or the two Batei HaMikdash. So the question is there a hidden message in the fact that it's choosing carbon Pesach? And the Gemara is saying, yes, there is. Why? Because what's unique about a carbon Pesach, at least as it pertains to the obligatory karbanos, is that carbon is unique in that it's a chiyuv, and it's a chiyuv at a specific time. When I have a carbon that is a chiyuv, that is not at a specific time, what would be an example of a carbon chiyuv, specifically a carbon sibor, that is a chiyuv that not at a specific time, would be, there's two examples that Rashi brings here, but the Gemara refers to it as chovos, obligations, she'ein kavu lahem zman, that are not specifically related to a time, but rather they're related to, it's a response to something that happened. So there's two examples. So it's a type of chatas, but a chatas is a personal one. So personal chatas is that goes in.
Voluntary though.
A personal chatas has to go on the in the Mishkan. That has to go in the. You can't go on my own personal one. We're talking now about the karbanos of Etzibor. The karbanos of Etzibor, the communal karbanos, and there's a good question here. Then why did they choose carbon Pesach, which is a personal? So that's a good question. But the point is we're using carbon Pesach as a model and saying that if carbon Pesach is specifically related to a time, then any other. And here's the issue here: carbon Sibor that's time specific, that has to be brought on the Bama Gedola. And if it's a carbon Sibor that's not time bound, meaning it can happen at any point, then those aren't even brought up at all on the Bama Gedola. And that would be the distinction between the Bama Gedola and, let's say, the Mizbeach that would exist inside the either two Batei HaMikdash or the Mishkan and Shiloh. Now, what would be an example of something that would not have been brought up on a Bama Gedola that is brought up on the Mizbeach inside the Beis HaMikdash? Two examples. There's something called a Par Helam Dover Shel Tzibor, and there's Se'er, right. So there's two times. So we have Sanhedrin, there's the 70 Chachamim. They made a mistake. They passed from the Shaila, and it led to all of us eating something that's a Chiyav Kares. If Rov of Klal Yisrael ends up eating something that is a Chiyav Kares as a byproduct of a mistaken psak by Sanhedrin, then we all have to, as a tzibor, bring a carbon. That's called a par, cow, helem dover, meaning it's hidden, meaning they were mistaken in their psak, shel tzibor of the community. Now that carbon is brought up on the Mizbeach only in the times of the Beis HaMikdash or in the Mishkan and Shiloh, whereas if we're talking about in the 71 years when we were allowed to bring our own personal karbanos in our backyard, we wouldn't bring that one up. And then there's another one called the Se'er Avodah Zarah, which is the exact same halacha, except that their psak didn't lead to an eating kares, it led to us doing Avodah Zarah. Meaning they said you could do this, I don't know, they said go into a church, and we thought that was okay, it turns out it's Avodah Zarah, let's say that's okay, so we have to bring, now there it's not a par, but fine, okay, that's the general idea. So what's come
from the first Chiyav carbon Sibor?
Say it again?
Who's going to cover zero?
I'm saying was Pesachim the first Chiyav carbon on Klal Yisrael?
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah, I would assume, yeah. I mean, it's before.
There was no Klal
Why don't we
Yisrael
just answer
before.
that? Doesn't that make sense then? To say-
Why is it chosen in the Mishnah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the question is a good question, really more about as a response to how I explained the Gemara. I don't know if so much the Gemara is saying why did it choose a carbon Pesach and not some other carbon. The Gemara is just observing. It did choose carbon Pesach. I must assume it's like that. I was really trying to give it I was trying to narrate the Gemara, and maybe your question is a good question on me, but unfortunately, no one cares what I think. And on the Gemara, I think not.
It's also the most common carbon for probably most people.
Yeah.
Do it.
Like for instance, you mentioned the shlamim. So let's say it's Pesach time, right? So I have to bring my shalmei chagiga, which is separate from my carbon Pesach. So that's an obligatory carbon. I would not be allowed to bring that in my backyard. I can't just wake up Pesach morning and be like, I don't want to go to shul today. I'm just going to bring up my carbon in my backyard. No way. Got to go into the Beis Hamikdash or into the Mishkan, even during those 71 years.
Don't wait. Please.
Oh, okay, no problem. Okay, second Mishnah. So what did we say before? We said that when the Mishkan came into Eretz Yisrael, for the first 14 years it was in Gilgal, and it's during that time that it was mutter to do a bama, mutter to do a personal altar in my backyard. And then we had Shiloh, and I said, in Shiloh, you were no longer allowed to do bamos, except that after Shiloh stopped, there was a 57-year period where you could. And then we had the Beis Hamikdash. That means really Shiloh and the first bias, and maybe the second bias, seem to have the same status. They seem to have this collective status that you wouldn't be allowed to bring a bama. And again, it makes sense. Meaning, however much Kedusha existed, the higher the Kedusha in Shiloh and the Makkah and the Beis Hamikdash, that's going to necessitate an Isser bama outside of that area. If this place that Hashem says, I want you to bring a carbon, has a level 100 Kedusha, that means you cannot do it anywhere else but here. But let's say the Kedusha is only a 50, maybe the implication with that is, we really want you to do it here, but if you need to do it in your house, you can do it. You understand? So there's that type of a distinction. So now the second Mishnah is coming and saying, well, what really is the difference between Shiloh and the first Beis Hamikdash? Which really, if you think about it, on a philosophical level is, why do we even need the Beis Hamikdash? I mean, if Shiloh and the Beis Hamikdash is really the same thing, then why aren't we waiting for the fourth Beis Hamikdash? Like, what was, Shiloh would have been the first, right? First Beis Hamikdash would have been the second Beis Hamikdash would have been the third, and we're waiting on the fourth. That's obviously not the case. So the Gemara is trying to understand that there clearly was a philosophical difference why Hashem didn't want to build a bias. Shiloh was just a Mishkan.
The walls were stone, but the top was...
there are definitely distinctions. And even in our Mishnah, we're going to see it. There's many more distinctions than just what's mentioned.
It wasn't the coveted. It was a tent.
Yeah, it was a tent.
Even though it was stone, right, it was stone, but it had...
the Beis Hamikdash was a new
And it wasn't Shleim.
Gala Deluxe, 5
Got a
pounds.
picture here.
Oh, wow.
No, that's Shiloh? No.
Yeah. It's an illustration of the.
Okay. So what does the Mishnah say? Ein bein Shiloh liYerushalayim, ela shebShiloh ochlin kodshim kalim umas hashenim bechol haroeh, uVyerushalayim lifnim min hachoma. Kan v'kan kodshim ne'achol lifnim min haklayim. So let's pause. Okay, I want to just work it. Yeah, we're going to touch over here. So a couple of things. When a person brings a carbon, there are two essential categories that the carbon could fall under. One is Kodshe Kodshim and one is Kodshe Kalim. The Mishnah in Ezehu Mikoman that we say every morning if you get to davening early enough, and I'm sure we'll learn it very stark with detail in Rishonim, explains the difference between all the different carbones. But we're going to do the 101 version. And when Mitch someone get this welcome to the parak, we'll learn that up too. Now, what does it say? Ezehu Mikoman that breaks down all of the different carbones. There's basically two categories.
How do you remember everything? You got a photographic memory?
No.
It's everything.
No.
He's Kevin.
You don't have a photographic memory?
Market share,
Yeah.
right in there.
Yeah, do this
You have a photographic memory?
No.
You don't?
No.
Okay.
Crazy. I think I unmute. Did I unmute?
Yeah, do this much.
Okay, actually, I'm muted. So let me tell you guys. Actually, I'm an alien. No.
Well, you came
A
from
Vulcan.
Shemai.
Maybe a Vulcan.
And that's what happened to JFK. Okay, now.
I'm getting the booster tomorrow.
Yeah.
Weiter.
Yeah. So what is the Mishnah say? Let's go back. Kachei kachim, kachei kalim. What is the difference? There are many differences, but the fundamental difference is kachei kachim are on a higher holy madrega, whereas kachei kalim on a lower holy madrega. The main distinction between the two is kachei kalim, the lower level, which includes, by the way, a shlamim, a toda, a meiser behema, and a bechar. Those are all really just different forms of a shlamim. Okay. Those are eaten and they can be eaten even outside the Beis Hamikdash, outside the Azara, and they can be eaten as long as they're inside the walls of Yerushalayim. Okay.
Where's Shiloh again?
Shiloh is I think it's in Samaria. I think it's in the Shomron.
So we're talking about Yerushalayim at the time of the Beis Hamikdash versus Shiloh at the time of the Mishkan.
Yeah. So now, although don't quote me on the geography of that, I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in what we'll call the West Bank. Yeah. So. Okay, so kachei kalim are eaten inside Yerushalayim. They don't need to be limited to the Beis Hamikdash, whereas kachei kachim, those can only be eaten inside the Azara of the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, if a person eats it outside the Beis Hamikdash, kachei kachim, that is a big problem. Yeah. Now.
Yeah, of course.
Now let's work this out. What else needs to be eaten in Yerushalayim? So we know two things. I think we have Meiser Sheni. Right, and we have also Ravoy, I believe, which is really just another form of Meiser Sheni. Now, what is that? What's Meiser Sheni? Bikurim, thank you. Right. There are a lot of halachas that apply specifically to the city of Yerushalayim as it pertains to where you can and can't eat. So this is the question: when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, did the city of Shiloh get that same sort of a status? Meaning, the same way the Beis Hamikdash created this sort of like enveloped area around it called the city of Yerushalayim. That's where my kachei kalim, my Meiser Sheni needed to be eaten. Did Shiloh have that same sort of halacha? So our Mishnah says yes. However, not exactly. What was the distinction? So the distinction was that if I was in Shiloh, living in my apartment overlooking the Mishkan, so would I be allowed to eat my kachei kalim or my Meiser Sheni on my porch?
No.
Well, it depends. If I could see the Mishkan from where I'm sitting, the answer is yes. If I'm from where I'm sitting, I can't see it, the answer is no. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's effectively the question that Rishon discussed. Does it mean that I have to see the Mishkan? Does it mean I have to see the city? Does it mean I have to see it if I'm sitting, if I'm standing? But basically, the idea is it's very similar to almost like the halacha of Chalav Yisrael, that in order for me to be able to drink the milk, I have to make sure that if I were to stand up, I can see the guy when he's milking it so that it'll make him not mix in his pig milk. But same idea.
But Shiloh had no walls. So
Shiloh had no walls,
Say
right.
up to the wall. Yeah, it was
Right.
undefined.
So that is true. There's a practical matter, but there are, I would assume, there probably were some halachic understanding of where the city ended.
Right.
So it could be a practical matter, but also what we're saying here is halachically, if I could see it. Meaning, what if I'm sitting on? Well, actually, if I'm on the Yeshel Torah porch, I think I'm inside the walls. But I'm saying, what if I'm sitting at the Dan Pearl Hotel, if that still exists? I don't know. And I'm sitting on the porch, and maybe I'm technically outside the walls of Yerushalayim, but I'm staring in, and I can see the Mokum HaMikdash. Would that work? Am I allowed to have my Meiser Sheni over there, or do I have to schlep inside the walled city of Yerushalayim,
You're looking down, you see
or whatever it is?
And
Exactly.
we discussed this a few days ago in the context of Mukafos Chomo.
Yes.
Seeing versus,
Right, exactly right. In order for an unwalled city to be considered a walled city is if it's nearby or even if it's far away, but you can still see it, same halacha. Okay, so what is the Mishnah saying? That Ein Bein Shiloh LiYerushalayim, Ella that. Let's read it inside. Ein Bein Shiloh LiYerushalayim, meaning, but in halacha, this is the only nafkamina. Ella Shebeshilo Ochlin Kodshim Kalim, like we said before, like a shlamim, u'meiser sheni b'chol haroa, meaning b'chol haroa as long as you could see it. Whereas Yerushalayim, it's lifnim and hachoma, and the diak there is, of course, Yerushalayim has a choma, whereas Shiloh doesn't have a wall. Now that's as it pertains to kachei kalim. Kan, however, in Shiloh and Yerushalayim, kachei kachim ne'echol lifnim and haklayim, that needs to be eaten inside the makam hakadusha, meaning for the Beis Hamikdash it would be inside the Azara, and for the Mishkan it would be inside the Olamayat. There's no klayim in the, there's no curtains inside the Beis Hamikdash. The curtains were only in the Mishkan, but the Mishnah is using that lashon for both. But the point is, kachei needs to be eaten inside. They can't be eaten in the city of Yerushalayim. That is the first half of the Mishnah. The Gemara is not going to be discussing that at all. So if you understood that, great. If you didn't, don't worry about it. It's not going to affect you as we move forward. The next half of the Mishnah is really what's going to introduce the first half of today's daf. Today's daf, I think, is maybe one of the most schizophrenic dafim you'll ever see. The very first half of the daf is entirely very, very deep halachic sugya, and the second half of the daf is an entirely agadata discussion. Although there are many dafim like that. And this shas, literally, as you turn the page, just okay. So what does it say? Kedushas Shiloh, second half of the Mishnah. Kedushas Shiloh, a second difference. Yesh achreha heter, ukedushas Yerushalayim ein achreha heter. So this is as it pertains to the bamos. We said before that I can bring a bama. I said before the way I told the story was that, you know, the first 14 years you could have a bama, then in Shiloh you couldn't have a bama, then after Shiloh we said during the bias you couldn't have a bama, but after Shiloh you had the 57 years where you could have a bama. So where did I get that from? I got that from the end of this Mishnah. Zok the Mishnah, Kedushas Shiloh yesh achreha heter, and Kedushas Yerushalayim ein achreha heter. Meaning, when Shiloh was destroyed and we were for 57 years in Noven Givon, was I allowed to bring a personal bama, a personal carbon then? Yes, I was allowed to. Whereas once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Pashas Bayis Rishon. So if I asked you what was going on for those 70 years between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, were they bringing karbonis or not? And again, I don't mean on the Mokum HaMikdash, I'm talking about in my backyard. It seems that the halacha was that not only were we not bringing karbonis maybe inside the Beis HaMikdash or the Mokum HaMikdash, but I wasn't even allowed to bring it up in my backyard.
Even in Yerushalayim.
Even in Yerushalayim, anywhere.
For those who live there.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
Not many people live there.
Yeah.
No, but when they came back, there were some years before.
Yeah. So if you read through, so that we're going to touch on that a little bit.
Okay.
If you read the Psukim in Ezra, it's very clear for the first 20 or 30 years they were bringing karbanos during the binyan habayis, even though technically speaking the Beis HaMikdash didn't exist, which is going to be very, very negay of the Gemara we're about to. So again, let's just understand what are we stating here at the. Gene, too far away. I need you closer, man. I need the warmth. I need the warmth. I'm bringing you close. Okay, so there we go. Oh, that's good.
Whoa.
Isn't that better? Isn't that better? Perfect. Okay, so what does it say at the end of this Mishnah? Again, what we're saying is that Shiloh, the city where we had the Mishkan for 369 years, and the Beis HaMikdash, which we had for 410 years, in between those two, there was a 57-year period where we had the Mishkan in Noven Givon, and during that time, our Mishnah is saying after Shiloh, we were allowed to bring a bama, you were allowed to do a personal backyard carbon, whereas once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, for those 70 years in between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, there were no personal bamos, and the pashtus would be that when the second bias was destroyed, the same thing is true, that you wouldn't be allowed to bring a personal carbon, which will answer the halachic shaila, am I allowed to have a mizbeach in my backyard and just go ahead and whatever. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak. This statement of Rabbi Yitzchak is a very cryptic statement, and it touches on a lot of really cool ideas. So let's read it through. Rabbi Yitzchak. Shemati shemakriven bebeis chonyo bizman hazeh. So there's a little bit of a history lesson here. We're not going to go too deep into chonyo, but I'll just tell you chonyo. It's a Gemara in I think it's a Gemara in Menachos. So who was chonyo? So there actually were two chonyos. One chonyo was the son of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the Kohen Gadol. He served in the Beis HaMikdash, and Chonyo was one of his sons. Shimon HaTzadik had another son named Shimi. There's a machlekes of Meir and of Yehuda in Menachos about exactly what happened over here between Chonyo and Shimi. They had a big fight. What was their big fight? It's actually a very interesting story. There are two opinions as to far what happened. What everyone agrees on, Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda both agree that Chonyo eventually left, and he went to Mitzrayim, he went to Alexandria and built a bama. He built a temple. In fact, he built a temple down in Alexandria and modeled it almost entirely after the Beis HaMikdash. And this was a problem, meaning forget for a second whether what the story behind it was during the Zman of Bayis Sheni, which would, according to what we just read in the Mishnah, clearly be an issue because it's during the Zaman Beis HaMikdash. So even if you say that after the Beis HaMikdash you were allowed to have a bama, you certainly were not allowed to do that during the Beis HaMikdash. So what Chonyo did was wrong. It's not. Now, when I say that, what I'm going to point out to you is that what I just said is not muskam by all the Rishonim. Mm-hmm. There are certain Rishonim who hold that what Chonyo did was not only mutter, but if it was even ideal. If I have a minute, I'll explain it. So who's Chonyo? He's the son of Shimon HaTzadik. He and his brother Shimi had a big machlekes.
Bamas don't have to be in Eretz Yisrael. Is that
no. Yeah, well, that's besides that. Yeah, Bama could be anywhere. I mean, that's why.
I was just thinking that. Yeah. Will we all agree to that, or
I'm not gonna. I don't want to state.
Yeah, it probably comes from this sugya.
Yeah. I think So a bama, I mean, it's not limited. I don't believe it's
Doesn't
limited to
seem.
Eretz Yisrael.
Okay.
Yeah, if a bama is mutter, it's not limited to Eretz Yisrael. It
Okay.
seems.
Okay.
Okay, so again, so who was Chonyo? Chonyo was the son of Shimon HaTzadik. He was a Kayin. Shimi and Chonyo, notice no one calls their sons, well, they do call him Shimi. Maybe that's a riot to which opinion in the
Shimi.
Gemara. Shimi. But Chonyo, you don't really see, although it is probably short for Yochanan. I mean, that's the Pashtus.
We have Choni Hamago, which is very similar.
Similar, that's true. But we also don't call people Choni. And so, yeah, either way. Choni, yeah. Okay, so Lamaisa, what happened? They were both Kohanim, and after Shimon HaTzadik died, so the question who is going to be the next Kohen Gadol? Now, it happens to be that's not typically the way it's done, but Shimon HaTzadik wanted each Meir and Rabbi Yehuda argue over who was supposed to be the next Kohen Gadol. I believe Shimi was the older one. So the Gemara brings over there that according to, I believe, Rav Meir, what happened was that Shimi did a terrible thing. Shimi, in order to prevent Chonyo from becoming the next Kohen Gadol, spread a rumor. No, worse than spread a rumor, he convinced his brother about the instructions of the inauguration of a Kohen Gadol and told him that he has to wear these certain effeminate clothing, leather, very, very, sort of implying that he was a mishkav zachar, that he was a homosexual. So, and he sort of spread that rumor. So when he showed up to do the inauguration of the Voda wearing these very effeminate clothing, he then, instead of saying, it was a prank, so said to all of the other Kohanim there, it's because it was a gift from his lover. That's literally what happened in the Gemara according to Rav Meir. And therefore Choni, embarrassed, picked up and left, went to Alexandria, and really almost out of a sense of like rejection of the entire Avoda, said, I'm going to build a Beis HaMikdash LaAvodah Zarah. That's the opinion of Rav Meir, that it was Avodah Zarah, that what he built in Alexandria was a temple that was for Avodah Zarah, meaning mamish, like the way we talk about Avodah Zarah. That's the opinion of Rav Meir. Then there's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, says the story was a little bit different, that what happened was that really Shimi was supposed to be the Kohen Gadol, and Choni was the one who perpetrated this sort of story, saying that Shimi, he told Shimi that when you go and you're inaugurated, you're going to wear these clothing, the exact same thing about Shimi. But there, instead of Shimi taking revenge on him, the Kohanim were able to figure out that that this was what Chonyo was trying to do. So they kicked him out. Interestingly enough, when they kicked him out, so he wasn't rejecting them, they were pushing him away. So he said, all right, you don't want me over here, then I'm going to bring the Avodas Hashem down to Mitzrayim. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, what was built down there was a kosher. When I say kosher, I mean it was not being served, it was not serving Avodah Zarah, it was L'Shem Shemayim. So there's a machlekes, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, as far as the bama that Chonyo built. Was it Avodah Zarah or was it not Avodah Zarah? So that's the first step. So Rabbi Yitzchak to Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak Shamati Shemakrivim bebes Chonyo bizman hazeh. Now it's important to understand Rabbi Yitzchak is not a Tana. Rabbi Yitzchak is an Amayra. We'll see later on in the Gemara that he was having conversations with Rava. Rava was an Amayra also. So Rabbi Yitzchak is an Amayra. Pashtus, he lived in Bavel, and he's saying that nowadays the temple that exists in Chonyo, which is really not clear how that could have existed. Historians all say that when the Romans came and destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they followed it up by going down to Alexandria eventually and destroying the temple down there as well. So it's a shaila that historians will have to address, but we're going to take the Gemara on as a davar push that there was some sort of a remnant of that temple, and that temple, that Chonyo's temple, they were still being makriv korbanos. At least this is what Rabbi Yitzchak heard. So now, the statement that Rabbi Yitzchak said he heard it doesn't mean he heard it like, where did he hear it on the subway? He heard it from his Rebbeim, meaning as if to say it was good. What was going on down by the temple by Chonyo, that bama, the karbanos that were being brought up there were good. Now that assumes, of course, two things. Dr. Gemara, Kisavar number one, Beis Chonyo Lav Beis Avodah Zarah. He obviously is taking the side of Rabbi Yehuda in that machlokes I mentioned earlier about whether the temple itself was an Avodah Zarah a thing or not. Clearly, it wasn't. Why wasn't it? Let's just ask it simple, very balabatish. What's the raya?
The Yitzchak said it was good.
Well, he just said you could do it now. Who says that it's avodah zarah now? Maybe the karbanos that are being brought now are kosher karbanos.
What was the question?
Meaning, if the question was in the times of Shimon HaTzadik or in the times of Chonyo, was it avodah zarah or not? Who cares? Maybe now it's kosher. Maybe now they're using it properly. What did we say before? We brought a sheet of Tosfos that said that it can't be that we're going to use the churches and the base Batei Avodah Zarah to daven in. to learn Torah. No way, right? That's Shitas Taisvus. Not all the Rishonim are masking to that. Can you buy a church and use it, or no? Do you have to bring it down to raise it to the ground and only build up on something after? So I was thinking from over here, if the Gemara is bringing a raya that it wasn't Avodah Zarah, it must be like Tosfos, that the only way it would be mutter for us to bring a carbon on something like that now, if it was in the past Avodah Zarah, would be if you destroyed it. But from the fact that they're referring to it as Bes Chonyo, the implication is that it has not been destroyed. It is still in its usage, even though it was once used for Avodah Zarah, and yet our Gemara is saying there's no way it was done for Avodah Zarah, because then it would be usher for us to use it now. I think that's a raya to Shitas Tosfos, although I don't really know Rishonim will argue with Tosfos, but there are in the Gemara at least before. So whatever, the point is, step number one is Rabbi Yitzchak's statement that it was mutter for the karbonos to be brought on this personal altar down in Alexandria. That must be that it was not Avodah Zarah. 1. 2, and this is the key for our Gemara, ukesaver kedusha rishona kitchel shata, v'loy kitchel asad lava. Let's read the words slowly. Kedusha rishona, when the Beis Hamikdash was built and there was a special kedusha imparted to it, that kedusha was put in the Beis Hamikdash and therefore on the Makom Hamikdash. Kitchel shaita, that holiness existed at that moment. Not only that, there's a machlokas whether that kedusha lasted or it left when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed.
70 years.
Yes, but then it came back in the Bayis Sheni. But after Bayis Sheni was destroyed, it would have. Right, yes, Enochanami. Meaning we're talking about the 70 years in between, correct? Meaning because after the second Bayis, well, no, even after the second Bayis, was the Kedusha Rishona of Bayis Rishon still around, right? So if it was
a period of 1,000 years, roughly?
what's a period of 1,000 years?
I'm just saying that both Beis Hamikdash.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, between the
70s
first and the second and the in-between period, you're talking about 830, you're talking about 900 years exactly. From the first 410 and 420 is 830, plus the 70 in between. Yeah, 900 years from the beginning to end. So the question is, during those 70 years, and l'chora even after the Bayis Sheni nowadays, do we say that Kedusha is still around or not still around? It has nafkaminas and halacha across the board. Do we say that nowadays mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz is that deraisa derabanan? If that's one shita rishonim, machlekes Rambam and Ravid. Another question will be whether you're allowed to walk on the Makom HaMikdash, you're allowed to go up on the Temple Mount. Is that a?
But they say the second time it's still around.
You're talking about, there's a Gemara that says
The
that.
second one was more because it was done by Ezra, by people who wanted.
Meaning that they wanted there to be a kedusha, but
more kedusha there.
yeah, but it could be that doesn't rise to the level where it would be a deraisa. It could be that would only be a derabanan. Okay, so what are we saying? Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Ashata v'lo Kitchel Asad Lava. Meaning during Bayis Sheni, right? Chonyo had this bama. Then Bayis Sheni was destroyed, and now here we are many years later, and Rabbi Yitzchak saying down in Alexandria they're bringing a carbon, and that's okay, which means it must be that originally it was never for Avodah Zarah. Let's just leave that. We'll assume that that's the case. But not only that, it must be that the kedusha of the first Beis Hamikdash never left. Sorry, loy kitchel asad lava, it left, and therefore, since it left, you are now allowed to do a bama. So the Gemara is assuming, at least at this point, that it's a if the kedusha stays, bamas are usher. If the kedusha is gone, bamas are mutter. And again, like I said before, during the times of Shiloh, during the times of the first Beis Hamikdash, and during the times of the second Beis Hamikdash, that for sure you are not allowed to do a personal carbon in your backyard. The question is, what about in between and after? If in between and after the kedusha still remains, then the same rules would apply now as they did during the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas if that kedusha left, well, if the kedusha left, then the reason why I can't bring a personal carbon left, then I would be allowed to bring a personal bama. Meaning, this question, at least at this point in the Gemara, of whether we'll say kedusha rishona was kitchel ashata and kitchel asad lavo or lo kitchel asad lavo, would be a nafkamina of whether I'm allowed to have a personal carbon in my backyard or not.
Almost like an insult to the kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash. If the kedusha goes away,
Then it's
there's
exactly
no insult anymore.
Exactly. Okay, so now, first things first, the Gemara wants to suggest that this opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak is predicated on this idea of kedusha, whether it left or not. The Gemara says, what is the drasha that would allow one to conclude that it left? The chsiv, the pasuk, is talking about where the psukim tell us it's in Dvarim where we're allowed to bring a bama. Talking about bamas, yeah? The pasuk says, Kiloi basem ad ato el hamenucha vel hanachla asher Hashem Elokecha noisein lach. You have not come yet ad ato until now el hamenucha, to the menucha and to the nachla. Menucha is rest, and nachla is inherited. So what does it mean? Dr. Gemara, menucha zu shilo. When it says over here that you can have bamos, it means you can have bamos up until you get to Shiloh, and until you get nachla zu Yerushalayim, until you get to Yerushalayim. What's the implication? The implication is makish nachla lemnucha, that just like ma menucha, meaning Shiloh, yesh achreha heter, you can have bamos after it was destroyed. So to af nachla yesh achreha heter, you can have bamos after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Now you might ask, how do I know that you can have bamos after Shiloh? Well, that's sort of inherent in the drasha. Why even mention nachla? Just say, once you have Shiloh, there's no more bamos, and that's it. And now I'll know that after Shiloh, you still can't do it, and it'll be also forever. Elamai must be, by mentioning nachla, you need to reintroduce the idea that bamos are a problem, right? That must mean that in between Shiloh and Yerushalayim, it was mutter. Once I say that, now I have a pasuk that has both of those dinim. I have a hekesh that teaches me that so too, bamos are going to be mutter after the Churban Bayis Rishon. This is how the Gemara at this stage wants to explain the halacha of Rabbi Yitzchak, that it's predicated on number one, Chonyo's Beis Hamikdash or whatever, his temple was not Avodah Zarah, but rather it was L'Shem Shamayim. And two, since the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash left, and nowadays the Kedusha is gone, therefore I'd be allowed to bring a bama, what's going on down over there is mutter. That is how the Gemara wants to say. Now, before we continue the Gemara, I just want to point out that at this stage of the Gemara is linking the sugya of Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Ashata, Kitchel Asad Lavo to the sugya of Bamais. This is not so, because, and as we'll see, the way to read the Gemara here is going to depend on whether you hold that the two ideas are connected and it remains connected, or if you hold that when the Gemara is now about to say that Rabbi Yitzchak was choser, the Gemara is being choser from the connection between the two ideas. What's enough mean of what I'm saying? Are we saying that bamos will always be usher no matter what you say with this machlokas, or is bamos mutter or usher dependent upon this machlokas? Okay, so let's read it inside. Amruleh, his talmidim said to him, this is another reason why we're not going to finish the Megilla stuff, because it's a complicated. So again, I don't want to shortchange it. Not even because it's geschmack. Just you can't read it without really understanding.
How will you catch up?
No, this stuff moves fast. It's psukim. It takes time to prepare, but reading through it takes 2 minutes. Well, I mean, we could say a lot on it, or we could skip. Okay, so Amruleh, they said to him, to Rabbi Yitzchak, his talmidim said to him, Amras, you really said such a thing? Meaning there was a chiddush here. You're taking part in two big machleksim over here. Gemara says, Amrlahu, lo. No, I never said such a thing, which is not true. He absolutely said it. Rava said to him, Elikim Amra, what do you mean? I was there. I heard you say it. Ugemirna lamine, I remember hearing you say it. I swear I heard you say it. So what's going on over here? So he's lying? So the Torah says he's Meshanim Ipnei HaShalom. Meaning what? Why is he lying? Because he really, it seems, and this is a discussion here, he was choser. The question is, what was he choser from? Was he choser from saying it was mutter because he no longer holds Kitchel Shata, Kitchel Asad Lavo? Or is it because Lo Kitchel Asad Lavo and now he holds that it was Kitchel Asad Lavo? Or was he being choser from connecting it to that sugya? And that Lo'olam, he's not taking part in that discussion. And really, he's just saying, I don't think it has anything to do with it. Now, what would be the reason why he was chayzer? Umay taima kachaderbe. Gemara says, Mishum kasher the Reb Mari. What was Reb Mari's question? The most of Reb Mari asked from our Mishnah, which is why the Gemara is discussing this. Kedushas Shiloh yeshach heter. You see that Shiloh has a heter bama afterwards. Kedushas Yerushalayim einach heter. You can't do it afterwards. And that's pretty emphatic. Why was Rabbi Yitzchak saying it was okay what they were doing by Bamas Chonyo? If that was a problem of a Bama, if Kedusha, we explained that if it's based on the Kedusha existing, it should have been Usser. So they asked from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says very clearly that after Churban Abayis, there's no more Bamais. So how could he say that it's Mutter? So he was Chayzer based off this Mishnah.
And it's a Stam Mishnah.
And it's a Stam Mishnah, although, exactly, yeah. The Otnan and another Mishnah in Zohar, Mishabol Yerushalayim, meaning when they built the first bias, Ne'esru Habamos, V'lo hayo lahem od heter. He hoysel lenachla, and that is the keem of the pasuk when it says lenachla forever. Meaning when we said before that the heter bomus exists, it existed only between Shiloh and Nachla, and after Nachla it never came back. This is a Mishnah. So now what is this basically saying? The Tosfos asked it as a question. It's probably the best way to express the question. The Mishnah is, Rabbi Yitzchak said you can bring a carbon on this bama, even though it's after Churban Habayis. You don't know a Mishnah? meaning it's a Mefurish Mishnah. Rabbi Yitzchak is an Amayra. I mean, I know people who probably knew this Mishnah. Rabbi Yitzchak certainly knew it. Tosfos asks it, I know the Mishnah. How did Rabbi Yitzchak not know
Once
this
in a
Mishnah?
while, they didn't know a price.
Right, but a Mishnah they knew. Always know a Mishnah.
Yeah.
So how could it be? So Tosfos explains that really, it's not that Rabbi Yitzchak didn't know the Mishnah. What Rabbi Yitzchak was saying was that I might have this Mishnah that says you can't bring a bama, but what if I told you that bamos are connected to the sugya of kitcha rishona, kitcha l'asad or lo kitcha l'asad? That would mean I have other Tanayim who say not like that. So if I connect this sugya to that sugya, then it's not just the Stam Mishnah. Then there's one Mishnah saying no, and I have 100 Mishnayos maybe saying yeah. If I don't connect the two sugyas, then you're right. All I have are two Mishnayos saying you can't do it. What am I thinking? So when he was choser, what was he choser from? Was he choser from connecting the two sugyas, or was he not choser from connecting it? He was just choser based off of the fact that you're right. I didn't realize there's a Mishnah that's mashma that I can't do it. Right, and depending upon which way you go in that machlokas, it's really a machlokas Rashi and Tosfos, and it's also, I think, a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ravid. But fine. So now the Gemara says, regardless, and I'm going to read the Gemara with Rashi, meaning we're going to read it as if we're still holding on to connecting the two ideas. The Gemara says, l'chura it's a machlokas tanoim, meaning until now we're just bringing it off that Rabbi Yitzchak holds kitcha lo kitcha lasad lavo, and therefore you're allowed to bring a carbon in your backyard after the Churban Abayis. That is actually a machlokes. Tanahi, what's the machlokes? We're going to bring one machlokes and then push it off, and then we're going to bring a second machlokes and say it is that. Tanahi, what's the machlokes? Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Shamati, I heard, Kishal Yubonin Behechel, when they were building Bayesheni during the times of Ezra. Osin Kloim, they made curtains, Lehechel Ukloim Lazara. So again, the Azara is the outside area, the Hechel is where we had the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So they put curtains up around it. And why did they do that? Well, so I'm going to say it outside. The reason why they did that was because, well, we're going to assume at this point that Rabbi Eliezer is under the opinion that the Kedusha left, and therefore there would be no heter to bring karbanos. And we know if you read Ezra that they were certainly bringing karbanos at this time. So the only way they had a heter to bring karbanos was because they had to create a kedusha. How did they create that kedusha? By putting up curtains. By putting up curtains, you created almost like a temporary binyan, and therefore that was enough that it was ma'ala the kedusha of the makom that now we could start bringing karbanos. Ella, he just says that since the builders, the construction workers, were not allowed to obviously go into the heichal, so they put the curtains up a little bit inside so that they could stand outside of it and not be inside the heichal while they were building it. They build the walls from the inside, so therefore the kloyim, the curtains, could be on the outside, right? But the point is, the Gemara is seemingly saying that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is, we're not going to say it emphatically now, but I'm going to say it. The Gemara is going to say in a moment, clearly Rabbi Eliezer holds that the Kedusha Rishona was Paka. Because if it wasn't Paka, then why do you need to go ahead and build these walls? The Kedusha is just sitting there. Just go ahead and bring up a carbon. Rabbi Yeshua said no. Shemati Shemakriven, and again, you have to remember, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer lived much later. And we're talking here about what were they doing in the beginning of Bayesheni when Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer were not alive. So that's what I mean when they say Shemati. I heard from my Rebbeim, heard from their Rebbeim, heard from their Rebbeim. So they each have a Messiah as far as what went down during the building of Bayesheni. Shemati Shemakriven Afal Pisha Ein Bais. They were building even though there was no curtains, even though there was no walls. Ochlin Koche Kochim inside the Azara when Alpha Pisha ain't claim, even though there were no curtains, or really not only no curtains, no walls, no nothing, just on the Makam HaMikdash. Kochim Kalim, and they were allowed to eat their shlamim, Umaiser Sheni, Alpha Pisha Ein Choma in Yerushalayim, even though there was no wall. Meaning, even though all of this stuff was gone, and what's Rabbi Yeshua's reason? This is part of his words. Mipnei Shekdusha Rishona Kidsha Lashata, U Kidsha Lasad Lavo. Therefore, Michlal the Rebbe Eliezer suffered loy Kidsha Lasad Lavo. So the Gemara is trying to say that Rabbi Yeshua and Rebbe Eliezer are having a machlekes, even though they're not talking to each other. These are just two separate ma'amorim, but they're saying effectively two different stories as to what happened. And if the reason why Rabbi Yeshua said you could bring karbanos without building the walls is because he holds that the Kedusha was there, it must be that Rebbe Eliezer holds you needed the walls to make the Kedusha there because he holds the Kedusha is not there. Why? Because that's their machlekes. Exactly the machlekes that Rabbi Yitzchak sort of picked a side in to say that the bama of Chonyo was okay. Tov? Okay. Amar Le, Ravina Ravashi, again, so Ravina Ravashi coming many years later saying, wait 1 second, who says that Rebbe Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are arguing in this? Maybe Rebbe Eliezer agrees that La'olam, the Kedusha, was always there. And of course, if one wanted to, they could bring a carbon on the Makam HaMikdash. It's just that the curtains were for different reasons. All right, so Amar le Ravina le Ravashi mimai dilma de kule alma kedusha rishona kitchel lashata kitchel lasadla. Well, maybe the kedusha was always there. Umar mai deshmiya lekamar, and Rabbi Eliezer was just telling over what he heard. Umar mai deshmiya lekamar, and Rabbi Yeshua was just saying over what he heard. Meaning again, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer would both agree the kedusha was there. You could bring a carbon. You'll ask a question. So then, what was Rabbi Eliezer saying that they built the curtains for? The curtains really weren't needed. V'chitema kiloyim le Rabbi Eliezer lomali. More answers. Let's news about Alma. That wasn't the halachic thing. That was just a practical matter, just to make it sneeze. You put up a fence around the construction site, so they put up a fence around there. Various different parts of the construction of the bais, so you didn't have gawkers and what do they call them, rubberneckers walking by, looking at what they were doing. But la'olam, it could be these Tanaim will all agree that the kedusha was there. Meaning what? If the kedusha was there, you certainly were not allowed to have a bama even in the times of the Amoraim in Alexandria, and Rabbi Yitzchak's halacha was incorrect, and therefore it makes sense that he was choser, right? I mean, he first initially said one way, but now you see maybe it's a machlekes tanaim and he had something to rely on. No, la'olam he doesn't. He doesn't have a machlekes tanaim to rely. He doesn't have, a machlekes tanaim rely on. It'll be that both shittas hold the kedusha is still there. The Gemara says, well, maybe we can find another. And again, it seems like the Gemara is trying to find the support for his initial opinion, because right now we don't have any Tanaim saying that you'd be allowed to bring a bama, because if you hold the kedusha still there, bamas would be usher. So we have our Mishnah, the Mishnah in Zvachim, and now two shittas Tanaim, at least according to the Gemara, that all hold the kedusha still around, even right now, which would mean personal sacrifices in my backyard is a problem, which means that Chonyo's Beis Hamikdash in Alexandria, even in the times of the Amoraim, would be a problem. So the Gemara says, Ella, I'll tell you from a different place to Machlek. So like honey tonight, it's like the following two Tanaim. So we're going to bring here just outside, we're going to bring a statement of Rabbi Shmuel, and we're going to bring another statement of Rabbi Shmuel. We're going to point out the stira in the statement of Rabbi Shmuel and conclude that it must be two different Tanaim, Aliba de Rabbi Shmuel, and those two Tanaim will be saying whether you hold, have a great day, we'll be holding whether we say Kitchel Ashayt Rishona, Kitchel Asad Lava, or like Kitchel Asad Lava. Let's see it inside. The Tanya, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosi, Lama Manu Chachamim Meselo. This is talking about the sugya of Batei Arechoma. Batei Arechoma was, again, the real estate law that said inside a walled city, I have up to 1 year to redeem. After that year, it goes to your family forever. I don't get it back in Yovel. Whereas if it's outside of a walled city, it's from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, and I sell it to you, I have up till Yovel to be poda, to redeem it, even against your will. And in Yovel, it comes back to me anyways. So the question is, which cities have that status, which cities don't have that status? And the Gemara is going to attempt to say that the Kedusha that we're talking about by the Beis Hamikdash is Hainu Hach. That's the same Kedusha that relates to which cities had this din and which cities didn't have the din, even if it had a wall. So what does it say? Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi asked the following question. Lama Manu Chachamim Meselu. It's talking about a pasuk that mentions specific cities and only mentions 9 of them. And he says it's because when they came back up the second time, they went, and these were the 9 cities they went to that had a wall, and therefore what they did was they were mekadesh each and every one of them. Meaning what? Aval Harishonos, the other 60 or so, whatever it was, bitlu. When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the first one, the kedusha of those cities as a Batei Arichoma Tika Halacha went away. Mishabat Laharetz. So what do you see? Alma Kesavra Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Ashata Velo Kitchel Asad Lavo, because they needed to reestablish those cities as having kedusha. A couple of assumptions in this Gemara. Assumption number 1 is that when we talk about the sugya of Kitchel Asad Lavo, as it pertains to the heter bamais, or as it pertains to the heter to bring a carbon on the Makam HaMikdash, that's also going to be the same shaila about Batei Arichoma. That's a little bit of a difficult, I think, just to the uninitiated person, that's a little bit of a difficult thing. It seems that Batei Arichoma was a statement, it's a din in Torah related to, at the times of the kibush, which cities had a wall, which cities didn't have a wall. If it had a wall, the real estate laws in that jurisdiction is like this. If it doesn't have a wall at that time, it doesn't have that law. Who says that that's related to Kedusha? It seems that that's just an administrative halacha. Obviously, Batei Arichoma is a mitzvah, but I'm saying the idea behind it is a little bit hard to understand how we connect the two. Same thing, by the way, I mentioned it earlier in passing, the idea of Kedushas Haaretz as it pertains to the mitzvah Satliyas Baaretz, meaning is it necessarily so pashut? I believe there's a Taisvus, I think it's a Taisvus in Zvachim. Taisvus in Zvachim says that when we talk about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael being Paka or not Paka, that has nothing to do with the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael as it pertains to the mitzvah Satliyas Baaretz. He says it could be you can hold that the Kedusha is still here today and it's not there for mitzvah Satliyas Baaretz. You could say that it is there for mitzvah Satliyas Baaretz and it's not there for Karbanis. He says the two things have nothing to do with each other.
And what about Purim? Is Purim connected to Bater? In other words,
No,
you could ask the same question.
You could. The difference is, though, since Purim to begin with is only a din derabanan, and when the Rabbanan were miyasa the halacha, they were just modeling it after the same model of Batei Arichom. I mean, you saw in the Gemara earlier when Chizkiah had a suffix whether he should lane on the 14th or the 15th.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a good question, but Pashta's not. But I'm not 100% sure. So what do you see from this first sheet of Rabbi Shmuel? The Gemara can stop right now. Meaning, what are we trying to say? We're trying to find the shita who holds loy kidsha. Well, we just found it. Meaning, the Gemara could stop right now and say, well, I have Rabbi Yeshua, who clearly said that kedusha still exists, and here's Rabbi Shmuel saying it doesn't exist. This should be the end of the Gemara. I found my machlekes. The Gemara wants to point out that it could be Rabbi Shmuel, and again, Rabbi Shmuel didn't say the words Kitcha Rishona, Kitcha Lashata, Lo Kitcha Lasad Lavo. He just said that these 9 they needed to be Mekadesh them. Must be, he holds, that the Kedusha was Paka. But it's the Gemara concluding that. The only Shita who we have in the Tanakh, at least in our Gemara, mentioning this question was Rabbi Yeshua, where he emphatically said that you didn't need to do anything, build any walls, because the Kedusha was still there. So the Gemara brings a brisa that's a steer to this in Rabbi Yishmael itself, or Minu. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yosef, V'chi Elu Bilvad Hayu. Seemingly, it's the same lashon. Are these the only cities that are Bati Arichoma? V'halok Farnamar, doesn't the pasuk say Shishim Ir Kol Chevel Argav? Lists all the pasukim Muksiv, and it says Kol Ela Arim Bitzuros Choma Gavoa. These were all the walled cities, and it only mentions 9, even though there was a significantly 60 more of them. Ela Lama Manu Chachamim Esel. So this just sounds like a repeat of the first one. The Gemara says Kisha'olu Bnei Hagoyla Matzu Elo V'Kidshim. So far we have a repeat of the exact same halacha. The Gemara says, one second. The Kidshim, I think this Bryce is a mistake. The Gemara is acknowledging that they are quoting this Bryce incorrectly. Flipped over. Hashda ha'amri loitzricha l'kedushi. All of a sudden now you're saying that you don't need to. Don't we say later on that he didn't need to be makdishit, that they were already retained their kedusha? Rather, the reason why these 9 were listed was because these were the ones they happened to pass through, so he listed them. But Einachanami, the remaining other 60 or so, they already had their kedusha, and not only that, below Elu Bilvada, Lakol Shatala Lacham Misoras Biyotcham Yavusecha, Shemukvas Chomim Miyamos Yoshua Ben Nun, any city that has this Masora, that it had a wall in times of Yoshua Ben Nun, Kol HaMitzvahs Halalu No Hagenba Bate Arichoma, and maybe perhaps some of these other halachas. Here Rashi mentions Megilla, although all of the Achronim go to town. The Rishonim go to town on Rashi on that. But the point is, it's mentioning any city, any halacha that as it relates to having a walled city. It also relates to a Mitzorah going outside of Yerushalayim. The halacha is no hegesba. Why? Mipnei shekedusha rishona kitchel l'shaita ukitchel asad lavo. Therefore, this brisa clearly is saying that Rabbi Shmuel holds kitchel asad lavo. So which one is it? Is it the first brisa that says lo kitchel asad lavo, or is it this brisa that it was a kitcha? So Gemara says kash the Rabbi Shmuel. So Gemara says no. Trade tonight. I'll leave the Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. That's one answer. But again, it would be 2 different tanoim holding kitchel asad lavo. Maybe the one that the second one that said that the kedusha was paka is Rebbe Lazar. The Tanya Rebbe Lazar Rebbe Yossi Omer Asher Lo Choma. Asher Lo Choma is written Lamed Vav. Now the way the Gemara is implying it is it's mashma that it's written Lamed Vav it's written with the Vav, which is there to make a drasha. Sorry, it's written with the aleph that gives you the ability to make a drasha. Lo with a vav, lo with an aleph means there is or there is. We saw this earlier. The emes is that's not actually true. The pasuk I think says asher lo chama with a vav. It's just that there's a kri and a ksiv on this Masora yeshem lamsor yeshem lamikra, and we darshan in both directions that what afal pisha ein le achshav v'hayu lo kodem lochein. So you see that even though the kedusha existed for Batei Arichoma when it came in, if it left, the kedusha remained. So what do you see? You see that Rebbe Eliezer holds that kitchel l'shaita, kitchel asad lavo. We see earlier kitchel l'shata, lo kitchel asad lavo, and therefore that's the machlekes hatanoim about this kedusha.
So we're switching the Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi that said kitchel l'shata, kitchel asad lavo to Rabbi Eliezer.
Exactly. Meaning it's a gears change. So now that we have this machlokes, the way Rashi learns the Gemara is that, okay, so now it's almost like a question, really. Well, why was Rabbi Yitzchak really choser? Really, he has now a Tana to rely on, which is Tosas' question.
He was choser because he changed his mind. But it would have been terrible if he had no basis at the beginning. I think that's not as strong.
No. So okay, so that's how Rashi learns the Gemara, that really we were connecting, when we're connecting Bati Arichoma here, we're also connecting the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash not being paka to the sugya of whether you're allowed to have a bama or not. We're connecting it to the sugya of Bati Arichoma. And although Tosa says what he mentioned earlier, there would be another question: is does it relate to the Kedusha Haaretz as it pertains to Mitzvah Tzliyas Ba'aretz? This is a big discussion in halacha. It gets a little complicated, but who was it on the? There's I forgot the name of it. The website that does the Daf Yomi Be'in. I forgot what it's called. Either way, he had Rabbi Aaron Sorsher had I just want to quote who I was listening to. He brought down this Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher's the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, asking the Shaila about why are you allowed to nowadays bring a carbon, bring carbonis.
He's a big name in religious Zionism.
Yeah. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger, so the two questions that were asked then were, or the two issues were, number one, could you do it if we're all tummy? We don't have a parat to get rid of tumas mace. That's one. Which Tumah Hutra B'tzibur L'chora would be a heter for that. Although it's not ideal, but I mean, we certainly didn't do it by Hanukkah, but generally speaking, Tumah Hutra B'tzibur is something that we rely on. The other issue was going to be having yichus by the Kohanim, that although nowadays we rely on the family history of families, when you find Kohens that are not Kohens, but generally speaking, we can assume that if there's a Kohen nowadays, at least as it pertains to halachas, most of the halachas nowadays aren't as serious. You're talking about maybe brach levatala. If they're not really a Kohen, maybe you're talking about being matame, going into a base oval, whatever cemetery. But generally speaking, we'll rely on the yichus of Kohanim nowadays for that. Whereas if you're talking about bringing avodah in the base of English, you're talking about chiv kares. It could be we wouldn't rely on that. So since we don't have good yichus on the Kohanim until we actually have a Navi telling us let's build the base of English, we won't do that. So there's other terutzim as to why we don't. One of the other discussions has to do with the material of the big day kahuna of the Kohen Gadol, that he needs chelas for. I think it's the avnate and one or two of the other ones, which is also be a problem.
Restoring korbanos is really hard, and they also tried a lesser step, which was restore the Sanhedrin, restore the Smicha, and then we could be
maybe
we could do certain things. That was tried recently.
And there's really two discussions. Yeah. Discussion number one is, can we do korbanos nowadays on the Makam HaMikdash? Question number two is, leaving that aside, can we just do bamais? Meaning those are two separate shilas. So the shilah of doing, it's clear from the Gemara that if you hold Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shaita, Kedusha L'Asadlava, that we'd be allowed to bring a carbon on the Makam HaMikdash. There might be some ancillary reasons why we can't, like mentioning, maybe there's Tumah, maybe there's a problem of Yichos, there's a problem of Tchelas, there's another problem of, can you really identify exactly where the Makam HaMikdash is? Because that's Ma'akev if you're bringing the carbonas up in the wrong place. Although that they say that maybe it could be that we say that might not be Ma'akev if it's a question of how big the Mizbeach was. So that's also a shaila. Halach l'maisa, in terms of the sugya of Kedusha Rishon, Kedusha L'Shat, Kedusha L'Asadlava, I think the Rambam paskins, he paskins that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is Midrabanan, that was Paka, but he paskins that the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash still is intact, and therefore, theoretically speaking, according to the Rambam, you would be allowed to bring up the carbon, whereas I do believe the Ravid is cholik on him there, and he says, no, Kedusha Rishon, like Kedusha L'Asadlava. So it's a very geshmaka conversation, because it really sort of like opens up the avodas Hashem that we have. It's almost like, it philosophically for me just changes the idea of, when we say, oh, we wish we have the bias back, we talk about the Shechina, of course, we talk about the other things. What about bringing korbanos? Well, that may be allowed. You may be allowed to. It may just be a technical reason that we can't do it, but it could be, theoretically speaking, that you could bring a carbon.
And it's closely related to this question of, does the Beis HaMikdash just come down from the Shemaim, or do we build it? Meaning that philosophical difficulty.
So let's see what time it is.
We could stop.
Yeah, let's stop here. We'll pick up from the Agada tomorrow. It's a little early, but...
You paused it or stopped it?